United States rhetoric around a new post-war era made it into all of the documents at the end of World War II. And so the occupation of Germany shows us that the Allies committed to pursuing 4 Ds: demilitarization, decartelization, denazification, and democratization. That the Allies would cooperate in bringing about a new Germany. Demilitarization was pretty obvious, that the Allies did not want Germany to be a military force on the continent again. From an Allied point of view, the Germans had started a war in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. The Germans had started a war in 1914, World War I, and the Germans started a third war in 1939. The Allies did not want Germany to rebuild its military. At least Stalin didn't. The British and the French were skeptical of Stalin. And so the British and the French wanted West Germany to have the military might to stand up against a future Soviet threat. This began a rift between the Western powers and the Soviets about how to treat Germany. All of them were committed to a united Germany, but that united Germany meant something different to Western Europe than it did to the Soviet Union. Western European allies wanted a free, democratic state in the West that could stand up against a coming Soviet threat. Joseph Stalin, however, wanted to make sure that the Nazis would never come back. He didn't trust Western Europe with their ability of denazification. He was afraid that the Americans, the French, and the British would cut deals with former Nazis and let them get back into office. Decartelization refers to the breaking up of the big industrial firms in Germany. Large corporations in Germany before the war were allowed to form cartels. They had nothing like the Antitrust Act or the Sherman Antitrust Act in the United States. Instead, large corporations often got together, set prices, and rigged markets. The Allies broke up those large corporations and made sure they played by free market principles, at least in Western Europe. In Eastern Germany, however, Eastern Germany fell within Soviet domination of economic planning. They had no choice on how they would develop, and what the Soviets wanted most out of the Eastern Bloc was for them to pay for the reconstruction of the Soviet Union first. And so the Soviets saw East Germany, Eastern Europe, as a way to exploit the riches of Eastern European countries and have them rebuild and have the Soviet Union reap the benefits of that economic development in Eastern Europe. Democratization also meant different things to different people. In Western Europe, that meant free and fair elections, multi-party elections, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. The Soviets said that they valued these things, but that was up to a point. The Soviets feared an anti-communist or a counter-revolutionary backlash. This was part of Lenin's understanding of a dictatorship of the proletariat, that only the proletariat was mentally capable of participating in politics. And since most of the proletariat wasn't capable of participating in politics, that meant that the Communist Party had to rule for the people. And so for Eastern Europe, under Soviet domination, they all formed democratic regimes, which meant that the Communist Party ruled in the interest of the people. In Western Europe, democracy meant people voted for their elected representatives. Those elected representatives then had to answer to an electorate in regular votes. Two completely different understandings of the word democratization. As a whole, though, the Allies were not afraid to punish Germany for its wartime crimes. And so the border of Germany was moved westward. On this map, you can see the lined area that was given to Poland. And so the border between Poland and East Germany simply moved westward. Germany was also required to pay $2 billion in reparations. That would be in kind, which the Soviets took out. Soviets took machine tools, took factories, simply took them out of East Germany and moved them to the Soviet Union, and the form of monetary payments, where Germany owed money to the victorious powers. Between the Soviet brutality and the moving of the border, 12 million ethnic Germans picked up and moved out of Eastern Europe into Western Europe. 12 million refugees. This added to the jobs crisis after the war. This added to the housing crisis after the war. But these Germans were either no longer welcome in Poland, or they did not feel welcome and moved to the other side. This experience in Germany then shows the tensions between cooperation and zonal planning. The Allies had made it very public that they were going to cooperate with each other. They weren't going to fight over the spoils of war. They were going to temporarily partition Germany, and that temporary partition would then lead to German unification. But the differences in meaning between demilitarization, decartelization, denazification, democratization, those 4 Ds did not mean the same between the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets. The disputes over meaning then led, instead of cooperation, to the treating of Europe as different zones, an Eastern zone and a Western zone. The Western powers directed development in the West. The Soviet Union directed what was going on in the East. The tensions over planning reached a head with currency disputes. Most of Germany was reduced to barter at the end of World War II. The German Reich simply stopped existing, which meant the Reichsmark no longer exists. Germany had no currency. The currency was in cigarettes or stockings or food. Anything to trade became currency. To restart the economy then, Germany needed a currency. The Allies moved ahead and pushed ahead with their own currencies to facilitate the restarting of a market economy. This upset Stalin, and Stalin saw this issuing of currency as a betrayal. He'd expected a single German currency for all of Germany. And since the Western powers moved ahead without a single currency, he took this as a green light for him to go ahead with his own development in East Germany. The Marshall Plan also antagonized Stalin. He saw this as a slap in the face, that the Americans had gone alone by themselves without consulting the Soviet Union. Now, the Americans actually offered all of this funding to Eastern Europe. But under Soviet direction, the Eastern European countries declined American assistance. Stalin was even more committed to going alone. He wanted the Western powers out of Eastern Europe. That meant that the United States, the British, and the French had to leave Berlin. And so he placed a blockade. Now, he didn't call it a blockade. He simply said that the trains broke. He didn't understand how the trains that connected West Germany with West Berlin had ceased to function. He was going to look into that. But it was quite obvious from the outside that Stalin had placed a blockade on West Berlin. He thought he was going to starve the Allies out, that the only way to get in supplies was overland routes by train. What he wasn't prepared for was the American airlift, the Berlin airlift. One plane landed every 8 minutes in West Berlin. They brought in coal, they brought in medicine, they brought in food. And so the American Air Force brought in everything needed to keep West Berlin alive during this blockade. This embarrassed Stalin. There was nothing he could do to starve the Americans and the British and the French out of Berlin. And so he clamped the ring down tighter, but he did open up the trains. If he were going to get control of West Berlin, it meant reigniting the war, and that's not something he was willing to do in 1948 or 1949. The Berlin blockade and airlift then produced a divided Germany in 1949. The Americans, the British, the French organized the Federal Republic of Germany in the West. As a federal republic, voters went to the polls, they elected their representatives, and those representatives had to answer for their policy decisions. The Soviets then created the German Democratic Republic in the East. This government would be committed to the interest of all of the people. The only people that were smart enough, brilliant enough to take care of that would be the Communist Party. So while the German Democratic Republic had elections, they were single-party elections in which voters got to pick the Communist Party candidate of their choice. Sometimes this is hard to keep track of, which was East and which was West. One of the simplest ways of remembering which was a Western-style democracy and which was a Soviet-style democracy is that the Soviets and the Communists almost always put democratic in their title, so that if anybody wanted to know if they were a democracy or not, all they had to do is look at the name of the country, and since the name of the country had democratic in it, obviously it was a democracy. It was a Soviet-style democracy. Soviet-style democracy did not sit well, though, with most of the intellectual class and the professional class of Eastern Europe. This produced a flight of doctors, engineers, teachers, anyone who was trained and skilled before the war and understood the meanings of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, took flight and began to leave. The Soviets responded to that intellectual flight with a Berlin Wall, 1961. Now, this wasn't much of a wall to begin with. It was simply barbed wire stretched across the street. The Soviet Union ordered troops overnight to stretch out this barbed wire all around Western Berlin, and then controlled each access point from one part of Berlin to the other. They were checkpoints. Before this Berlin Wall, Berlin was a unified city, and people simply moved from place to place. But what happened is people were leaving Eastern Europe, getting into Western Berlin, from Western Berlin getting on trains or planes and starting new lives in Western Europe. The Soviets wanted to shut that down, and so they created this wall. As the wall went up, East Berliners began to jump or flee. They did their level best to get out. Over the decades, that barbed wire was replaced with an extensive wall system. First a brick wall and then a large concrete wall. So you see the wall on the left-hand side that has this round barrier at the top to prevent people from grabbing on and slipping down. Between the wall that's on the left in West Germany over to the East Germany was a minefield, anti-tank barriers, and machine gun nest. All of this, according to the Soviets, was to prevent a Western invasion. This was a defensive wall. It was not meant to keep people in. It was to keep Westerners out of their workers' paradise. During these 4 years, Germans had very little say about what was going on in their country. Germany was prostrate between two superpowers. The Americans decided how the rebuilding effort would go on in the West. The Soviets decided the rebuilding efforts that would go on in the East. Neither the Americans or the Soviets wanted to push or challenge the other very hard, because if they did, they would have to go to war. Neither side wanted to go to war after World War II. They had had enough fighting, and they were satisfied to direct the events either in the West or in the East. This Germany, just like Europe, was divided between American domination on one side and Soviet domination on the other.